Good morning and welcome to the 32nd meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2024. Our first agenda item today is an evidence session on the promise, staff recruitment and retention. Can I welcome our first panel of witnesses? Claire Burns, Director Celsus, Fraser McKinlay, Chief Executive The Promise Scotland, Fiona Duncan, Independent Strategic Advisor, and Professor Trish McCulloch, Professor of Social Work and Deputy Dean in the School of Humanities, Social Sciences and Law at the University of Dundee. So welcome to you all. With a panel of four and a big committee, please feel free not to answer every question if you're just repeating what you've heard, but obviously there's a lot of crucial evidence that we've got to get through today and we're very grateful to you all for your time. Can I start off about workforce in particular and the importance of the workforce in achieving the promise? What assessment do the panel members make individually in your respective areas of workforce at the moment and the challenges that arises from workforce problems in achieving the promise? Anyone want to start?
Will I start?
Please.
Morning, everybody. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough, so hopefully that was. So I think, the fundamental issue here that any improvement we want to make, like the promise, that it's about services for people, delivered by people. So it sounds like a really basic statement to make, but unless we have the workforces who can deliver the improvements that we want, we won't be able to realise it. And we're not in a good place at the moment in terms of...
Just put your mic down a little bit, I think.
Sorry.
That's
that
perfect.
Better?
Yep.
Good. Good. That was really good stuff, by the way, that first couple of sentences. So I hope you caught it.
It'll be on the record.
So I hope you caught it. So, yeah, and I think we've got a bit of a, I won't go on too long because I want other people to speak, but just to say we've got a bit of a perfect storm at the moment. So we've got a recruitment and retention crisis in some of our key workforces, but at the same time we've also got significant increased need and complexity in the need of families who are coming for services as well. So, if we don't have the workforce that actually can respond to the need, then that's going to be really challenging. And I think the workforces are also saying to us, at the same time, we've got a really cluttered policy landscape with lots of duties, entitlements that's constantly layered onto them as well. So that perfect storm of a recruitment and retention crisis, increased need and complexity within families, and then increased duties and responsibilities for a smaller amount of workforces is going to make the implementation of the promise really challenging.
Ms Duncan?
Thank you. I think Claire's beautifully articulated the perfect storm, and I think one of the things that she's touched on that I'm sure the committee will be interested in is the range of workforces. So I know you have a particular interest in social work, but there's also teachers come into contact with children all the time, health visitors come into contact, GPs come into contact with the children. There's a breadth of workforce responsible for making sure that Scotland keeps the promise. And I think that, as Claire said, this is about people, and I think it is about recruitment, and it's about the gap between recruitment and retention. What happens to the workforce? Do they feel bogged down with bureaucracy and unable to do the job that they come into the profession to do? Do they feel that they've got the resources? Do they feel that they've got the time to develop relationships? Do they feel that they are supported to take the types of decisions and risks that they want to take? I think it's complex, and I think it's broad, and I do think there are challenges. I'm of the view that if Scotland does what it's always done, then not much will change. So for the promise to be kept, we have to do something different. And I think there is significant opportunity to do something different. I think one of the things that I endeavoured to do during the care review was not admire the problem, but instead pose solutions. And I think that we know a lot of the solutions already in terms of what the workforce is looking for and what the workforce tells us. And I think we now have to start to implement those.
But should we have started before now? I mean, the promise has been at launch for some time. It's been, up high in the political agenda. Former First Ministers and others have really prioritised this. Yet you're still coming to us at the end of 2024 with these challenges, and understandably, none of you have a magic wand to solve this overnight. So are we coming at this too late?
So I'm of the view, from engaging with the workforce at the breadth that I outlined and further, and also at some depth, that the work has started. So folk have been getting out of their bed to keep the promise since the 5th of February 2020, when the care review concluded. But also before that, every single local authority took part in the care review. They took part in a stop-go programme, which was trying to stop the things that should have stopped already and trying to do the things that should have been done already. So I think we've been working on this for a long time. I think my response to your question is we do now need something different. We know what we need now. I think that hopefully, I mean, Claire beautifully articulated the perfect storm. We need to take a different approach in order to weather that perfect storm and to get through the other side.
Professor McCulloch.
I think my first response to the opening question is, of course, workforce is an expansive topic. I mean, others have already identified that we're not talking about a single workforce. We're talking about a wide range of professionals who intersect in children and families' lives. So the first challenge...
A skill professional that
I
put them
was
on and
told
off
not
the
to
whole
worry
time.
about the mic, so that, not at all. So you know, we do need to respect the complexity of the promise and the different component parts of that and the workforce delivering it. As regards, are we too late? You know, I'm obviously coming here with a particular expertise around social work. We've been working on workforce issues within social work for several years, but of course we're working on that amongst very competing agendas, and quite often when a new policy initiative enters, the focus shifts. So for me, when the first thing is getting hold of what we're talking about workforce. We seem to be talking about a capable, confident and committed. So it's thinking about what do we know about what delivers these things? What are the obstacles to that? What are the barriers? And we do have research evidence that speaks to that. For me, I think what I'm looking to see when I look across the evidence is a very clear and integrated strategy that addresses these things: confident, capable, committed, from entry at the point of education right through to exit. So I would say we've had lots of initiatives, and people talk about a cluttered landscape, that's true, but I still don't see a coherent and integrated strategy that addresses workforce, not just workforce issues in numbers, but actually the kind of quality workforce we need around these particular frames.
Mr McKinlay.
Conscious of your steer not just to repeat everything that everyone else has said, Convener, so I'll be very brief, but I absolutely agree with that last point. I agree with all the points that have been made. I suppose my perspective is that we have been talking about these kind of workforce challenges in social work and more broadly for a long time. I promise I'll not bore members with my previous life in Audit Scotland, but we did do a report in Audit Scotland about social work over 10 years ago, and it signalled a lot of these challenges coming down the road. So my perspective is that the vision that the promise sets out is absolutely in line with the vision that I think the social work profession has for itself. I think we are absolutely committed to the same things. I think, I'm sure we'll come on to this, Convener, I do think some of the debate around the National Care Service is probably, I hesitate to say get in the way, but I think, you know, because people have been waiting for a National Care Service and a National Social Work Agency, some of the challenges that we know really clearly now, partly and in particular because of the research that Claire and the team at Celsus did last year, we are really clear about what the challenges and issues are, I think. The question now is, how do we solve them? And I think it is pretty critical now, as you say, as we get towards 5 years since the care review was published. I think the challenges around workforce and the opportunity for social work and social workers to be right in the middle of the change that everyone is looking for to keep the promise is now really urgent, I think.
And who does that burden fall on? Is it government? Is it local authorities? Is it society encouraging people to take up this role, to study and then become social workers? Professor McCulloch?
It falls on all of these groups. It falls on all of us, as all of our pressing societal challenges do. But we do know that we need leadership around that. We know that we need an infrastructure that allows ideas to translate into policy, to translate into practice. We we don't currently have all of these things. We don't have the kind of integration around the different bodies working in these spaces. 2014, we did a review of social work education that grappled with all of the things that the promise needs to be delivered. Many of these things have not been actioned. So for me, it's about it's what I said previously. It's the following that journey from ideas through to policy, through to implementation, and we know how challenging that is. And so it needs leadership right through to the implementation, and critically addressing the things that actually matter to the workforce who deliver that at the front line.
And what about the retention element? We're losing too many. Some only stay a few years after going through a lot of training and a lot of investment. What more can be done to keep people there? Ms Burns?
Yes, I think we've got good evidence now. I mean, just coming back to your previous point, because I think it's so important, is that we do need everybody to take part in this at different levels. So one of the things that came out really clearly in the research was we make more impact when there's an alignment between what national government's doing, what we're doing regionally and what we're doing locally. So if we want to support something like recruitment and retention, we need a strategy at government that's funded and supported regionally and then is supported at a practice level. If we try and do it at any one of those levels, we're not likely to be successful. There are some things that a lot of local authorities are trying at the moment, so really good support. They're much more focused on support for newly qualified social workers because we realise we need to retain them. We're thinking about buddy systems for people. We're thinking about how we get people back into the workforce after COVID. But they're piecemeal and they're not equally across local authorities. But what the evidence is telling us is that we need to pay attention to a number of things. So we need to pay attention to the public perception of working in children's services, particularly of that of social work, where it feels it's got a very kind of negative public perception about workloads, and so increasing numbers of workloads. We need to think about pay and pay scales across children's services, but it's also about things like, do we really understand what wellbeing is? We're doing some work just now to better understand what wellbeing is and work-life balance. So I think it's about putting all of those things in. And the last thing I say is that, really good evidence around the fact that because the work that social workers and others do is really challenging, can be quite traumatic at times, the elements around supervision and reflective practice are really fundamental to us. But these are the things that often go when things are so pressured. So I think we do know some of the things that we need to put in place, but that needs supported at all levels.
Okay, and just finally from me, the latest figures show that since 2019 there's been a 48% rise in the number of senior children's social workers, and that compares with a 2% fall in main children's social workers. Is that the wrong way round? Why do we have too many people in the senior roles and not enough at that main level? And what is the reason for that disparity in the figures? Professor McCulloch, is that?
I'm afraid I can't. I don't know the reasons. I myself was surprised when I saw the evidence of the 48% rise. I know there are some local authorities who have invested in senior practitioners, and these are exactly the things that the research evidence is telling us that we need to do.
So they're needed to do the supervision element that Ms Burns was just speaking about, or?
Some would be doing that. It's about having experienced practitioners working with children and families, supporting newly qualified early career social workers. So not simply doing the supervision and being one step removed, but actually being that experienced voice within new teams. We know that children and families teams have a quite often high turnover, very imbalanced in terms of newly qualified or early career. So the importance of senior practitioners remaining in practice. So I think some of those figures will reflect those initiatives that speak to what social workers and the research evidence tells us. But I think we need to understand the kind of fuller picture, which speaks to some of the research that we need to tell us what statistics mean.
Finlay, any comment on that?
So I suspect your next panel might know a bit more about that, convener. I suppose my only other observation in this discussion is that, as well as investing in social work and social workers, part of the answer to this conundrum has to be investing in community-based services. So it has to be about ensuring that families have greater access to early help and support. It has to be about mental health services in communities. Those are the things that help provide the infrastructure and the scaffolding that will support families, which in turn should provide more space for social work and social workers to begin to look at caseload, to begin to really focus on that kind of community-based social work that everyone wants to achieve. So again, there's no single approach to this. I think as well as investing in social work and social workers, there is a need to look broadly at what community-based support there are for families and children and young people in communities.
Okay. Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel, and thanks for your information so far and your answers today. You've said there are various challenges that we're dealing with, but what can the Scottish Government do right now to help with the situation? Professor.
I wanted to answer this question because it also speaks to the question you asked about retention, and this is central to the workforce issues we're talking about today. I'm just going to kind of summarise headlines from research we did with early career social workers, and we traced them, followed them from year 1 of practice through to year 5, and there was 4 things that they identified consistently, both across the cohort and across the 5 years. The first thing they asked us to do is to protect purposeful work. Social workers experience significance and value and reward, pride in their work when they're allowed to do purposeful work, worthwhile work. And that's all about care, support and protection, all the things the promise is committed to delivering on. So I would be asking the government to protect that purposeful and worthwhile work, which sometimes gets distracted by admin bureaucracy. The second thing they asked us to do was to design in quality and nurturing relationships, to design in a supportive environment that supports learning and learning through practice. So rather than leaving these things to chance to, for example, the senior practitioner or the peer who's in the office that day, thinking about how the environments that we work in actually support the kind of capable, competent workforce we need. The point that you've already made about reinvesting in community services, social workers can only deliver on these things if the community services are there. And the fourth one was about value, respect and reward, a sense of that work that is meaningful, that is purposeful, being valued by wider society. We have research evidence that tells us that the public does value these things, but it's not something that social workers are perceiving in their day-to-day work. So there are some core things that we can do that speak directly to retention issues, even at that quite early career stage around years 3, 4 and 5.
I think that's a very comprehensive response. Again, I think from the Scottish Government's perspective, I'm very struck by what Claire said earlier about the action at different levels, and I think obviously local authorities and for that matter third sector employers have a job to try and do everything they can to ensure that nurturing environment is there, recognising that it's a very difficult environment to manage that sometimes. But I was reflecting on when we were here just over a year ago, and I think we had expected a lot of this work to have progressed through the National Care Service and in particular the creation of a National Social Work Agency. And I think the intention was that the National Social Work Agency would pick up quite a lot of the national things that have been mentioned already. Now, of course, we know 12 months on that hasn't progressed. So I think the result of that is that I think people have kind of been waiting for that to happen. And as a result, we're a year on and actually looking at some of the evidence that we presented to the committee last year, not an awful lot has changed, actually. And that's clearly unfortunate. So I think if the National Social Work Agency is still the plan, then that needs to progress really quite quickly. If we think that's going to take a while, then I think some of those things that Professor McCulloch has mentioned need to be progressed anyway, I think, because we can't continue to wait for something coming down the road that's somehow going to fix it all.
I think, again, that Trish gave a really excellent summary. What I would like to see is a strategy, an integrated strategy, as opposed to a cluster of tactics. And I think what we have at the moment is a cluster of really good tactics. Claire talked about some of the things that are happening at local level, and we know that that those are making a difference to people's lives, to social workers' lives, but also to children and families and care-experienced adults' lives, if relationships are nurtured, etc. But we need something that's cohesive and that's planned and organised and time-bound, and that we know what we can expect by a certain time, which means that we know what changes will happen at a certain time. I think that's what I would like to see happen.
Two critical points I think I want to pick up. We did, as part of the research we did, we looked at international examples of transformational change and what made a difference. And just picking up on Fraser's points, one of them was if we want to do transformational change, we need a settled landscape. But actually we've got workers who are in quite an uncertain context at the moment about, is there going to be a national care service? Is it going to include children? We don't quite know what's happened with the National Social Work Agency either. So we're asking people to do a kind of really massive change programme without this kind of settled landscape. So I think that's one of the things that government could actually do, is how do we make decisions on these things and make it a more settled landscape for people. I think the other thing is we hear loud and clear all the time is that, and it goes back to the point about the amount of duties and responsibilities and policy and legislation there is we need to declutter that. And that is something that national government could do, because what people are saying is this: if you can declutter and we can come round 2 or 3 priorities, addressing poverty being one of them, and I think really positive to see that in the programme for government, that there's a real focus on that. It's fundamental. Then if you can take some of the other burden off us, we can start to do that longer term relationship-based work with families, but we can't at the moment because of the number of demands that are on us. For example, on reporting, so people feel like there's lots of different, maybe funding pots that come from different parts of government, and they spend their time trying to manage that, spend their time reporting on that, spend their time trying to manage short-term funding. So the more burden we can take off, the more time people have got to do the actual work with families that they want to do. I'm really struck as well that the Setting the Bar is saying that is what social workers want to do. They want to do the kind of work that Fiona set out in the promise. That's what they're committed to, but they don't feel able to do it at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you for those answers. The Independent Care Review's Evidence Framework report highlighted a lack of available evidence for non-social work areas of the care system workforce. How might the issues faced by those in non-social work roles be better understood?
Some work since the care review concluded to understand this, and I think Fraser and Claire and Trish have all touched on that sense of what does a community look like for children and families. How can families access a bit of support when they need a bit of support, which will help them nurture the love that they have and keep their children safe with them. I think there's also the question around what happens when children can't live at home and what type of support do they need in order to flourish and thrive and go on and be happy, healthy adults. And then for care experienced adults. So the care review was very deliberately expansive around a whole life and what happens on the edge of care, what happens in care, and what happens once somebody's left the care system. So the evidence framework was quite deliberately organised in a way which didn't narrow the lens just to social work. The care review totally respected the critical role that social work does. But some of the things that I think you're asking about are still absent. So, good youth work, for example, we've reduced budgets around that. The sense of children getting support with mental health and being able to access specialist services. Parents who are maybe struggling with their own mental health or struggling with substance use. So there's not a simple answer. Although there is a simple answer, but there's not, I can't boil it down to, and this is the one thing that's missing, but I do think a lot of work has happened. It's a bit like the convener said, should we have started before now? Well, we did start before now, but we know now what we maybe need to do next.
I'd like to also take the opportunity to highlight that we need a research infrastructure for social services and social care in Scotland that allows us to answer these questions. There is far too little knowledge on really core issues that in other parts of the UK we do have answers to these questions. We do have a research infrastructure for social services in other parts of the UK. Again, it's something that's been on pause while we wait for National Care Service or National Social Work Agency. But the absence and the kind of fragmented nature of research evidence supporting the workforce, supporting practice, has been highlighted over decades.
I think the only thing I would add briefly to that question is, as you know, the care review took a very broad definition of workforce, paid and unpaid, and a critical part of that, and a critical part of this whole debate, is the role that foster carers and kinship carers play in this wider system. And we know that the crisis in recruitment around foster care is very challenging. Number of foster carers going down, number of new households becoming foster carers lower than it's been in the preceding 4 years, and the number of deregistrations increasing too. So that's another part of the picture, I think, that again, in terms of that scaffolding that helps support the paid workforce in social work and other professions, and the Scottish Government's current consultation on a future for foster care is welcome, and there's a lot in there, I think, that has the potential really to shift the dial a little bit in foster care. But again, that's not a short-term fix, and I think people are kind of recognising that the normal approaches to recruiting foster care isn't really working in local communities too often. So again, that's another part of the jigsaw that we really need to focus on, which will help free up the wider system.
Just to pick up that point that Fraser's making, that's the point I was going to make around really seeing our kinship carers and our foster carers and also adoptive families as being part of our workforces. I think it was great that we got the recommended allowance for foster care and kinship care. It's been reviewed at the moment. Our plea would say that's got to keep pace with cost of living as well, and that we have to see what we're paying to foster carers and kinship carers as being part of our anti-poverty strategy as well.
Thanks, Kabir.
Okay, Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Thank you for the information that we've had so far. One of the things that kind of strikes me is that out there in the real world, we've got still significantly poorer outcomes for care experienced young people, especially in things like areas like education, where less than half of them are leaving school within Act 5. So we do really need to move on this, not because we've all said we will, but actually because outcomes are progressing in the wrong direction if we don't. And when we spoke to young people as part of this committee, they spoke about one young person said that, what's the point in calling it the promise? Because they felt that it wasn't being delivered. They also said, there's too much in there, we can't see change in any of these particular areas. And on workforce, one said, I've had 12 social workers in 4 years, 14 years, and at least 15 social workers over 14. So that kind of situation makes it very difficult to deliver on a lot of the aspects of the promise, but particularly the relationship building. So I want to ask a little bit about the evidence that, Celsius, you've given us, and where you've said that social work staff are only really getting to the top of their priority list. They're not getting any further than that. Can you tell me a bit about what that looks like in reality?
So what it looks like in reality is that that social workers feel like they can only really focus on what is their statutory responsibilities. And when it's their statutory responsibilities, what that means is that families have waited quite a long time before they've reached the threshold for engagement with services, and that means things have obviously become more challenging, more difficult, because the services that would have picked that up earlier have been cut. So actually, families tell us all the time, why are you letting me wait till I'm in crisis before you're helping me? But again, social workers would say, because of the increasing demand and the recruitment and retention, we have to all focus on what is our statutory responsibilities, so things like child protection. What that means is they feel that they're working in an environment which is about risk, which is about being reactive, rather than doing the work that they can do. So that's the environment that they feel that they're working in. And I mean, just to give you an example of some of the work that we've been doing through the whole family wellbeing, in one of the local authorities, we were focusing on families were saying to us, you need to help us with income maximisation. And I mean, we were mostly working with social work, and they were saying, OK, if it's income maximisation that's needed, but let us fund and allow health visitors to do that work, because families are saying to us, I want it done more universally, I want it done with people I've got relationships with, and I want it in a less stigmatising way. Set the situation up, and then there was a cut to health visitors, and we had to go back to social workers. So you've got this complete tension in the system just now between people trying really hard to meet the policy objectives, but the current financial climate just pushing against that all the time.
So what do you think we need to change to improve the conditions for staff in that respect so that they could deliver the change needed?
So I think there's a number of things. One of them is that I think we really need to reduce the number of priorities that we're putting on local areas. I think, we often flip from different focuses and different attention. Our research is saying some fundamentals are how do we address poverty. We know that there's a link between poverty and people who come to the attention of services. So how do we, and then can we make that alignment between what's funded, what's supported at a regional level, and then what's supported locally, and that we actually don't ask for a huge number of priorities to be dealt with over the next 2 or 3 years. So I think really focusing in on that. I think the other thing that's really difficult for local areas at the moment, but I think we've tried to do this through some of the whole family wellbeing, is say we cannot build a new system and keep responding to need at the same time. Actually, you need to give us some bridging funding to be able to get us there. Fiona and Fraser will often say the money's in the system, and they'll know what I'm going to say here is, I think that's not often accurate. The money's in the system, but it's locked. It will be years before that system's out, so I think we have to be careful about saying the money's in the system as well. We have to provide more investment for that earlier intervention.
Thank you. I don't know if Fiona maybe wants to respond, and Fraser after.
Yeah, so I think what Claire has articulated is right. One of the things that the Care Review quite deliberately did was look at, it wasn't a partial review. So it didn't say, let's just lift this one part out of this thing that we call a care system, take it over here, polish it and drop it back in. Because we know from previous reviews that the systems just consume it. You've heard today about the breadth and the depth of work that needs to happen. Which is why at the end of the Care Review, the report called The Plan set out a 10-year timeframe for transformational change, with the first year being a really detailed understanding of what needed to move first, what needed to move most, or what had the furthest to go. We didn't anticipate COVID. We didn't anticipate a national care service. We didn't anticipate a national social work agency. I think Claire's points about the lack of stability meant that we've been planning in flux. The other thing that the Care Review sought to do was identify solutions, not admire the problem. I said that a moment ago, and I think that's really important, in particular for the young people that you heard from. They talked about what good looked like and what wasn't happening now. So again, we know some of the things that we have to do. But one of the things that the Care Review quite deliberately did was ask, what are the root causes of care? What happens that bring families to the attention of this thing that we call a care system that isn't actually a care system, as Claire said, the sort of cluttered and complex bureaucracy. What are experiences like for children and young people in care, and then what are the effects of care? And if you look at the cause and the effect, there are recurring issues. Poverty is a recurring issue, substance use is a recurring issue, engagement with the justice system is a recurring issue, homelessness is a recurring issue. And when you start to understand that a number of people experience multiple systems at any one time, and that sort of sense of intersectionality and the struggles that families are dealing with, and which ones can be alleviated most quickly in order to ease the pressure and prevent them from having to engage with the care system. And that's really where we got to the conclusion that there is a lot of money already in the system. And Claire is right, it is locked. It is in the wrong place, but the money is there. It would require a shift from crisis spend to preventative spend. And that challenge about how can you respond to immediate crisis while introducing preventative spend is one that I think probably every single committee has struggled with, whether it is health, whether it is justice, regardless. And really that comes back to the point that I was making a moment ago. If we carry on doing the same things, then nothing will change. We have to do something different. We have to take a different approach. And I hope that the promise still provides us with an opportunity to do that, because there are people right now not watching this committee session, as hard as that may be to believe, who are working really hard instead to keep the promise, whether that is in schools, whether that is in social work teams, whether that is in the police, whether that is in health. And there is a real determination to do this, but we have to start doing different things.
And I don't doubt that, and I believe that there are many people trying their very best across the entire system, but it still all feels just a bit like pin and jelly to a wall. Like, it doesn't feel like there's a tangible difference or reality that would really improve for children and young people. I find it hard to put my finger on. If a young person said to me, what's the government doing today to improve the experience of children and young people? We can talk about strategies, we can talk about money being in the system, we can talk about unlocking it, but what is the real difference that that's going to make to children and young people across Scotland? I still can't get that from what I'm hearing.
So I don't entirely agree with you. I think that one of the things that I'm very determined to carry on doing, so the Care Review listened to over 5,500 experiences, and one of the things that I'm very determined to continue is making sure that I listen to the experiences of the care community. And I think there are two things going on quite often at the same time. The first is, it's not good enough yet. I think we know that. And I think that's what you heard. But the other thing that's going on is that it has improved. Things are improving. They're not improving fast enough. You know, every day that we don't get it right for a child is a day of a childhood lost. And I don't think any of us find that acceptable. But I do think that change is happening. There is an argument about pace, and there is an argument about the quality of change. I don't think holding individual workforces or individual sections of workforce responsible or blaming them is necessarily the right approach, because I've never met anyone who isn't trying to do their best, and I think you've heard from people who are very close to social work that the promise outlines what they want to do. And I think if we focus wholly on local, and actually, again, I think it's been beautifully articulated by fellow panel members, but if we focus wholly on front-end system service delivery and we don't deal with the deep-rooted systemic problems, then we will have a cluster of tactics as opposed to transformational change. So I do think we need to look at the money. I do think we need to look at the legislation. We have a commitment to the Promise Bill next year. I do think there's a lot of things that have to happen over the next couple of years for us to be confident by 2030 that Scotland is keeping the promise and that it's never gone back to the old ways.
Okay, thank you.
Willie Rennie.
Yeah, Fiona, I've got a problem. What Claire described was what I witness in my casework in my constituency. Several examples just like that, of families, of individuals in crisis, of social workers on their knees, they cannot cope. And then the question is put to you, and you talk in very high-level, vague terms, and you talk about substantial progress and fantastic work, while there's a fire going on in the basement. And that's where I've got a problem. Are you really speaking as clearly as you should be speaking about the crisis that is in the system?
I'm not naive to the crisis. I think only you can decide whether I'm speaking clearly enough or not. During the Care Review, I spent 3 years really deeply listening to understand from the people who experienced the system and the people who were the custodians of the system, multiple systems, not a single system, what needed to change. So my focus was absolutely on building solutions. For the last 4 years, almost 5 years, I have been facing into the system to push the system to make the changes that it has to make. The experiences that Claire has talked about, the experiences that you find in your constituency are absolutely true. But what is also true is we have great big systemic barriers. And if we don't tackle those, then all we're going to do is have a cluster of tactics of change. So the social workers that you engage with, the children and families that you engage with, they need both and. They need changes right now to what's happening at the front end, whether it's resources, whether it's purposeful work, whether it's more support within the community. They need that. But they also need legislative change. They need money unlocked from parts of the system that are a cause or effect of care but not considered part of this thing we call the care system. Either in isolation won't drive the change that we need.
Yeah, there's a disconnect. I mean, when I met care experience young people who came into this Parliament a few months ago, they were incandescent with rage. They thought it was all mumbo-jumbo, that it didn't mean anything, that nothing was really changing, and their experiences were just the same as they were before. They felt let down, they felt betrayed, and we have a briefing that you've provided this morning saying there's fantastic work and substantial progress. It's just a different world from what these people are experiencing. I mean, take the whole Family Wellbeing Fund. Yeah, the £500 million there, but it's been delayed. They weren't able to get the money out the door. Now, why is that? Why is that? Why is there not a peep from you this morning to say the money has been delayed? Why are local authorities not spending the money? This is what we've found, and we're calling it out. Why is there nothing on that? Anybody?
Can I come into that?
Yeah.
So I was hoping we'd get on to the whole Family Wellbeing Fund, because I think it is a classic example, Mr Rennie, of a thing that was a very good idea. And it does touch on Claire's point about investment for change. That was the whole point of that exercise. And the system has got in the way of itself. Now, I think we have been quite vocal about that, and I'm happy to say that in committee today, Mr Rennie. But I suppose my approach to these things, and absolutely you can disagree with this, is that both things can be true. So that I believe there is progress. I think I hear all the time, equally from care experienced young people, and also, importantly, care experienced adults who are able to compare what their experience was like 20 years ago to what the experience is today, who will say that it's different, and in lots of cases better. And there are things you can point to, whether that's a higher education bursary. There are objective things that you can look at and say that is different. There are things in place now for the care experienced community that didn't exist 20 years ago. And at the same time, the testimony you heard from those young people is absolutely true. That's the thing that gets me up in the morning. That's the thing that continues to motivate Fiona to make those young people's experiences as good as my own kids. And we're miles away from that. And that's why we're continuing to work.
Say it.
Say
it again. It's not being said clearly.
Well,
I'm not getting that at all.
So, okay, and I suppose I think, particularly in relation to some of the workforce challenges that we're talking about, I think, again, reminding myself of some of the work that's been done, it's been said a million times. Like, we know what the problems are. So the thing that I'm doing and interested in is how do we move it on?
But then we get a briefing that said there's fantastic progress and fantastic work and substantial progress.
Because, come back again, you can disagree with it, Mr.
Well, that's the headline. That's the only thing I see from the briefing.
And it also says in bold that there needs to be a step change in pace and depth of improvement. So I believe both things can be true. I don't agree with the assessment that nothing has happened in the last 5 years. I just don't think that's right. And I also believe it to be true that we're not as far on as we want, and there's still a very long way to go. I believe both of those things to be true.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Convener. Fiona mentioned earlier about preventative spend in particular, and we have, as a committee, heard evidence of the impact of preventative spend taking place in Glasgow. So just wondering if there are examples of where we're moving away from crisis spend to preventative spend, and how effective that is, particularly for the workforce. Anybody?
Yes, I think there are examples of where we're seeing that kind of move, where we're seeing initiatives being taken hold of within local authorities, within third sector organisations. And it's exactly the point that's just been made. And I'm going to go back to kind of the research with early career social workers again, because it's good to ground us in what the workforce is telling us. And what we found there was a kind of 3/3 pattern. A third of early career social workers spoke to the kind of things that we want to see, of being able to do that kind of work, of having protected caseloads, of having space to connect to the research, the evidence, of having time to work and build the relationships with children and young people. A third described an awful experience, the kind of experience that I think is coming into your constituency. Mr Rennie, and then there was this middle group who were kind of teetering along. And the conclusion we draw from that is we are not seeing consistency in the implementation of what we know to be our kind of good initiatives, best practice, evidence-based work. And that is why we need to also talk about plans, because we need to make sure that it's not a postcode lottery and depending on which local authority you happen to live in. So I think we are seeing these things and we're not, and we need to sort that out. It's not fair. But also, even if, when we ground this in, and as we should ground this in the reality of people's lives, even if this is improved, and you still don't have a safe and secure home, and you still don't feel like you belong, it doesn't matter that that's improved. It doesn't matter that you've had 2 workers rather than 8. It matters that you still don't feel secure. So doing a little bit isn't enough. It doesn't mean that we're not seeing different parts of this story.
Just before you come in, Fraser, does that strictly mean that yes, there is preventative spend, but there simply isn't enough of it, and that we need to actually be thinking about how we can increase prevention?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for bringing me back to the specifics there. Yes, and I think this is what's happening within social services and social care, that we have an initiative that comes in, and the people who are doing that work get around that initiative and say, let's do that. And they keep doing that until something else comes along. And then, oh, actually, we need to now do this. Sorry, we need to move budget from this to here. So, again, we don't see the longevity. We see quite rapid movement and then a kind of destabilised environment and workforce which doesn't deliver on best practice.
Thank you. And Fraser?
So I think, as I've mentioned already, I spent a long time writing reports about how we move public money around the system and get it into more prevention. It's a thing we have grappled with, and I think there's loads of reasons for that. And one of the reasons I came into this job was to try and actually help facilitate that shift, because in the end, that's the thing that's going to make the difference. And I suppose, without getting into a discussion about definitions, actually, preventative spend in relation to care in the care system does mean investing in anti-poverty. It does mean investing in housing and homelessness. So to give you a very concrete example, there's a UK-wide charity called the National House Project. There are 3 local house projects in Scotland, and Mr Rennie might know of one, because there's one in Fife, there's one in Eastern Bartonshire, there's one in Midlothian. And the local house project is all about taking cohorts of care experienced young people, supporting them for about 12 months or so before they get their first tenancy. And the results are phenomenal. I think I'm right in saying that across those cohorts, across those areas, they haven't had a failed tenancy yet. Now that's better for them because it gives those young people a secure home. It's better for the council because they have a tenant and a tenancy that sticks. It gives those young people a sense of community, much better in terms of outcomes and allowing them a bit of stability to go and get jobs and to go and live their lives. And it's a really good investment. Like, it's a really good investment for what they spend up front. You will be avoiding all sorts of costs that traditionally have come with that cohort of people as they go through the system. So that's just one example, I think, Mr Kidd, of where it is preventative spend, but it's a very specific thing in preventative spend around housing, and there are other examples too. And there's no doubt, to come back to the Family Wellbeing Fund, that some of the investment there has not reached the places it needs to reach yet. We have spent it, I believe, on things that matter to the system too often, and not things that matter to the families that are supposed to be feeling that difference. So we still have a very long way to go, but there are, and another very brief example, the work around the promise is very clear that care experienced children and young people should not be excluded from school. Those numbers went back up last year, as Ms Duncan Glancy said. Hopeful that they might be coming back down again, because what we can see is some brilliant practice in some places, so that there are now local authorities that haven't excluded a care experienced young person for 18 months. Now, again, I would suggest, and that's been intentional work, and I would call that preventative, because if those young people are in school, part of the school community, then they're more likely to go on and thrive. So much more we need to do on prevention, and I also think we need to not be too narrow in how we're defining it.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if Claire, you...
So I think, again, I've seen some really good examples. I mean, you gave the example of Glasgow. I think they've done a really good job in terms of preventative spend. But what I will say is we can't compare Glasgow with some of our really small local authorities, because the money that they're able to pool is much more significant. So I think how we support our smaller local authorities compared to what Glasgow are able to do. What was critical there, and I think it's one of the things that we need to spend more attention on, is there was an agreement about pooling budgets. And that, you know, but some of those conversations take months, take years to get agreement. You know, and in some local authorities we may not get those agreements. So how we're working with strategic leaders to say these are tricky conversations because there's winners and losers in here. What is it? What does it mean to pool budgets and agree on priorities? So I think there's that. We've seen the work we're doing in East Lothian. Again, really good. They really picked up on their increased need in their local area was around families where there was additional support for children with additional support for learning. That was really where their need was going on. They've moved resources into responding to that, particularly so that families didn't need to wait for a diagnosis before they got support, because that's how the previous system kind of worked. But again, some of that's been funded through whole family wellbeing, and there's no guarantee of the money ongoing. So again, as soon as we get a bit of momentum in the system and we're shifting to the right place, we don't have the other enabling things around it to maintain it and sustain it, like longer term funding. You know, so again, it's just going back to that. This tension that's in the system all the time because of the lack of investment, the lack of funding, between the aspirations of the Policy Directive, which people agree with, but the reality of where we are. And just to pick up on Fraser's point as well, he doesn't mind me disagreeing with him, but I suppose I would just say I don't agree that it's about things that matter to the system and not to families. I think what you're seeing is some of the funding going to where there's been gaps in there's been previous gaps in funding. So it's almost having to use preventative spend just to keep things afloat. So I think that's important as well. It's good he's nodding.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Thank you.
Clear.
Very much, Convener. And just following on exactly that point, the financial context, particularly over the last 3 years, excuse me, has been of really significant in-year cuts to budgets, of money being allocated at the start of the financial year, but then not distributed. Well, Rennie mentioned the Whole Family Wellbeing Fund. I imagine the answer to this is relatively obvious, but it's important to get it on the record. What impact is the current public finance situation having, particularly on our ability to deliver effective preventative spend? Professor McCulloch?
I can start and others will come in with specifics. When we talk with the workforce, they describe a picture of being a social worker, and I'm talking about social workers here, as a mix of strength and struggle. And the strength that they talk about is that meaningful, purposeful, worthwhile work, the kind of things that we all want to see. The struggle that they talk about begins with it's difficult work. It can be challenging. It can be emotional. But that isn't the real struggle. The struggle they talk about is the context of budget cuts, of diminishing services, and of promising things that they can't deliver on. So my answer is that context of budget cuts and the enduring nature of that is everything. It's what social workers, it's what makes people feel that, what am I doing here? I can't do this. And it has a significant impact on retention. It's the most significant factor because it impacts on levels of admin, it impacts on workload, it impacts on peer support, it impacts on seniors being there to support them. So in our research, it emerged as the most significant dimension, and essentially a sense that actually the only thing that seems to matter now is money. And what people want to be doing is care, support, protection, empowerment.
All that up, that issue around expectation. Is there an issue that often budgets are set pretty much with the knowledge almost from day one that the money that has been allocated is not ever actually going to be distributed with something less? I suppose my question to you is, if there's a promise of £10 million for Project X, but realistically it's only ever going to be £6 million that's given, would it be more helpful to just say from the start it's going to be 6, not 10? Or is there something helpful in encouraging the system to be ambitious and saying, here's what would you require to make the kind of change that's needed? What would you do with 10 million if you had it? 'Cause I think part of my frustration with a lot of this has been, it appears there's a huge amount of time wasted and then morale drained by people expecting to be given resources to deliver something and then either not given them at all or given something far less and having to then rewrite a plan that they've spent time developing.
I know that others will be able to come in with the detail, but for me, very simply, we need to, our ambition in terms of investment in social services needs to match our promise. The conversation that we're having that people are frustrated with is about the investment not matching and I'm not just talking about the promise here, I'm talking about the promises that social services make. And if the investment doesn't match it, then let's not make the promise. It's not really just about addressing it at the investment. All of our plans, there needs to be congruence between what we put in and what we expect them to deliver. Because what's happening is we're focusing on why are you not delivering those outcomes? And surprisingly, we have a demoralised workforce.
Thanks. Anyone else want to come in on the point around resources and expectation management?
I think the only point I would make is, in addition, is that I suspect, to use your model, I suspect a lot of people would prefer to have £3 million a year forever rather than £10 million over a shorter period of time. That consistency and stability of funding is the thing that I think we hear all the time that is problematic, because you don't know, and that is particularly, to come back to something that Pam Duncan-Clancy said, is particularly problematic when you are trying to build relationships in communities. So people are reluctant to really step into that work if they think that the people doing that work are going to have to retreat and they can't sustain it after 12 months. So again, it's a well-known problem. The third sector talk about it all the time. They've been long used to working in an environment where that kind of short-term funding cycle is something they deal with. You do see it increasingly in the statutory sector, I think. So I think, again, to use the perfect storm analogy, I think it is less money and cuts, which is absolutely problematic. And I think the headwinds have probably never been stronger than they are now to do some of this stuff. And second of all, it is the nature of that funding, which is still very siloed and very short term. And the combination of those things makes it really difficult for people on the ground to do the work that they would want to do. My only other observation, and this doesn't in any way underestimate the size of the difficulty just now in terms of the fiscal environment, but I would also reflect that even when Parliament had more money and had increasing amounts of money year on year, we didn't do prevention very well then either. There is something else at play in this discussion, I think, which is about where power sits and which is about how systems work, and it's about accountability. So absolutely reducing finances in the way at the moment is a problem for doing some of this stuff, and it makes it even more important that we figure it out.
I think the Scottish Government would agree with you absolutely on the challenges of annual funding settlements. It's a significant challenge for them as well. Do Fiona or Claire have any final comments around resources before I move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the biggest challenge we've got in implementing the promise. But just to pick up one other thing again that Fraser's saying around, and that Mr Rennie picked up as well, around getting money out. So again, I don't want to be an apologist for, if money's going to local authorities and that's not getting where it's needed. But if we actually want people to invest that in prevention and early help, it needs to be, they need the time and the space to plan for that. So I think there's also an argument for saying, actually, we need to be able to hold on to money at times to plan for that. Because what often happens then is we get a pot of money, local leaders get a pot of money, and it has to go out almost immediately. If it has to go out immediately, then you don't have a huge choice on where that's going. And then that's further reinforced by saying, and we would like you to report on that within a short time scale and tell us how it's impacted on outcomes. We've also got to get real about, what we're asking people to report on and where we expect short-term funding to impact on outcomes. So we need to say, actually, we're not going to be reporting on outcomes in 6 months or a year. That's 10 years down the line. But we do need those intermediate kind of progress markers to be able to say it's been working well. So I just think it's another tension in the system whereby money comes out and there's an expectation that it goes right out. If it goes right out, you don't have time to plan for that.
And the only point that I would make is when we're talking about how difficult the financial situation is for the system, let's not forget how difficult it is for children and families and care experienced adults, because the relationship between those struggles and the care system and coming into contact with statutory services is really significant, and we know that families are really struggling.
Thanks very much. Turn to a different topic, Fraser. This is primarily a question for yourself, just about the progress frameworks of. I look on the Plan 2430 website. Last line of it says that the progress framework will be here by the end of 2024. Is that still the expected timescale? So we're seeing this in next fortnight, basically?
Yep. Laura might give me a row for this. I'm not sure if I'm technically allowed to announce it, but I will anyway. 18th of December is our planned date for putting that on the website. Just very briefly on that. So the progress framework is the first stage of a longer-term project. The first thing that we'll launch in a couple of weeks' time focuses very much on a range of data that can indicate progress on keeping the promise at a national level. It's all existing data. It draws on a much broader range of data than anything has done in the past. So it does look at poverty, it looks at mental health, it looks at what we think are critically important contextual factors in terms of keeping the promise, as well as the ones you would expect to see in terms of number of so-called looked after children in the system. So that's the first stage, and I think does represent a big step on compared to what we've had in the past. And the most important bit of the work that happens from the start of next year is properly beginning to understand and measure the extent to which change is being felt in people's lives. So we have a lot of evidence about that already. This committee heard some of that from the group of young people you spoke to earlier in the year. That bit of work is about trying to build that into the system in a more systematic and coherent way, and that's the work that we'll be focusing on next year. So that was a big long answer to your question, which was yes, in the next couple of weeks. That's really positive and helpful. I'm sure we'll be looking forward to seeing that. Committee's well used to people coming to us to apologise for delays, so to hear that it's on track is really positive. So we'll probably want to follow that up in the new year once we've had a chance to look at it. You can remind me of that if something terrible happens in the next 2 weeks, but hopefully... yeah, hostage to fortune and all that, but thank you. I think we're just about there. Excellent, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Fraser, I think there's somebody behind you doing the cut sign at that point, but you must be pretty confident if you're committing yourself here today. Basically, I want to talk about future workforce development. We've all heard the challenges that are available. And Fraser, you yourself mentioned about the Audit Scotland report you were part of all those years ago. In fact, I think I was on the committee when we went through that report then. And the issues you're saying today, the challenges today are very similar to what they were then, in so much that a lot of even those that are involved in social work are going to like the third sector and things like that because they're actually delivering services, what they all wanted to do, you know, and they're not caught up in, okay, there's the statutory part of being in a local authority that always makes it a wee bit more challenging for individuals. But when we're looking at, you know, the challenges we've got is insignificant or insufficient applicant numbers, experience gap in candidates, pay competitiveness issues, and there's the usual kind of rural recruitment challenges as well, which is across the board, not just in this issue as well. So as we look to the future, how are we going to encourage people to come in to the profession, particularly because there's always a stack of people who want to come in and help people and be social workers, but when it comes to that cold kind of light of day, they kind of have it, the challenges are there and it becomes quite difficult for them. So how do we kind of still manage to pitch that idea that this is a way forward to get the type of people and those involved so we can deliver the promise?
I can start. Yes. I mean, certainly, you know, I've asked that we consider this problem from the point of entry, and that point of entry is often at the point of education. So in terms of encouraging people into social work specifically, to select one group, probably three things I want to highlight. We need to promote the meaningful work that social work and social care services do. There are wonderful stories to tell there. It's not something that we can't get behind. So there does need to be kind of national campaigns around promoting the value of social work and an understanding of what social work and social care is. So there's a promotion piece there, but not just a one-off, thinking about that in a more kind of longer term piece of work. We need to address the question of financial support. We know well, numbers are down in terms of, and have been down, and we can expect that to continue. The data that we have is that that's specifically about cost of living crisis and the costs of study. For social workers, that's particularly acute because they have extended periods of placement where they can't work. Almost all of our students are working while they study. You'll know that from your own areas. So we need to address financial support. The bursary for social work has been stagnant since 2003. It used to match fees at that point. That's for post-qualified. That's for postgraduate programmes where we attract a really high calibre of people into the profession who have their degrees and want to practice in social work. So we need to address financial support, we need to address the bursary deficit, and we need to think about how we provide financial support when these students can't work. We do that in other professions. We do it in nursing wonderfully well, and we see the dividends of that in retention. And I would say that getting these things right at this early stage does pay dividends in retention, because one of the things that matters in retention is feeling prepared. And if people are not feeling prepared at that early stage, we can expect that they're not going to survive through their careers. We absolutely need to solve some of the basics around that, like access to statutory placements, particularly when other initiatives come in and distract attention from that. And we need to address the basics of good education, good preparedness, supporting readiness for practice, as well as innovation. Sometimes when we hit these struggles around recruitment or around enrolment, we jump to a very innovative product. And we ignore some of the kind of core work that needs to continue through this piece. So there's a kind of request for care as we think about innovation there, and we're thinking about innovation in, for example, graduate apprenticeships. It's in the papers. We need to be really clear about what is the evidence for that, what will that deliver, what might be some of the unintended impacts of that, how do we progress that as part of a coherent workforce strategy.
When you're looking at different ways of kind of working, you know, a lot of like the bare bones of it, you know, a social worker turns up to support a family, I'm from the council, I'm here to help. That's not their first thought. But if you insert I'm here from third sector organisation's name or some other organisation, they'll automatically say, well, this is my problem, they might be more open. Is there other ways we can work to make sure that the families actually do? Because there is always that kind of part of, you know, I'm not saying that the social workers aren't professionals, they aren't doing their job to the best of their ability. All I'm saying is there's always that barrier that's put up with families when they say, hello, I'm here from the council, I'm here to help. It's not often something you hear.
Yeah, and I'm speaking to you as a social worker, as someone who, you know, stood at those thresholds. And the thing that we know is people respond to people. Mm-hmm. And that's why relationship-based practice is incredibly important. And it's not only social workers who can do that great work. So you know, I think the point I'm making is there's a broad workforce, and that's why I'm talking here about social work and social care. But I would say that the kind of obstacles of turning up at the door, and I'm here from the social work, these are obstacles that are and thresholds that social workers and social care workers cross every day. And again, they can do that when they feel confident in who they are, when they feel supported to be there on that doorstep, when they can go back to the office after a really difficult encounter and offload and process that, and the emotions are held. When they can go into supervision and they've got an experienced senior who's doing more than workload management. It is actually the core things that we know that workers need to cross those difficult encounters, those difficult thresholds. When you distill it down, there's 4 or 5 things at the local, and if we can get those into a national plan that is as ambitious as our promises, then I think we can deliver on those things. And I would say that in itself, if we address the retention issues, it will address the recruitment, because recruitment is down because people hear all the time about how difficult work social workers are engaged in. They're not hearing all of the things. In our early career social worker research, the pride and passion that social workers spoke about through the 5 years, Those stories are not the ones that people in schools are hearing. Many people who go into social work go because they've had a personal encounter with that, and they know the valuable work. So we need to do a much better, going right back to the promotion piece.
And the graduate apprenticeship programme that you mentioned, how do you see that as a way forward? Actually, people working within local communities and delivering from day one effectively. So it's not a case of you've got your qualification, you turn up and you're chapping that door along with someone else more senior with you.
I think we would talk about that as a kind of practice pedagogy, and I would say that commitment to rooting education in practice is at the heart of social work education and has been there since its beginning. So my first response is that's at the heart of all our programmes, and if that's taking too long to get people across the threshold, then we need to look at that. So, for example, our students are out in year one. It doesn't matter whether they're doing the graduate apprenticeship or not. They're out in year one, they're not in a placement, but they're in communities, they're crossing the threshold, they're understanding what does it mean to kind of work and support people here. They're shadowing, they're in agencies, they're in third sector settings. In terms of the graduate apprenticeship, there's a lot of debate about that. My view is I want to see it as part of this coherent workforce strategy, not as the new shiny thing. Mm-hmm. So, because we've had new shiny things in the past, the fast track scheme, and they delivered a number of positives and they created a number of challenges. So, for me, it's about what is the need this is looking to respond to. What impact will it have? What will some of the unintended consequences, and where does it fit within this coherent, integrated strategy that sits alongside? So I'm for it insofar as it supports a very kind of practice and applied. That has long been at the core of social work. Sometimes we're not delivering on that as well as we can because some of the fundamentals of social work education are compromised because of all the things we've been talking about here today around funding, investment, fragmented landscape.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, John Mason.
Thanks, Convener. Then to build on that perhaps, and maybe again start with yourself, Professor McCulloch, is the training, especially at university and so on, is that closely aligned to what people are going to actually experience when they go out to work, or do they get a shock? Because I think we had the comment from somebody that actually when they actually started working as a social worker, it was a lot better than they thought it was going to be.
In answering that question, I would start by reminding us of the findings of the early career social worker study, followed them from the point of entry into practice through their first 5 years. What we found was, again, this third pattern. A third reported a really positive experience, that they felt prepared in education, supported through the transition, and the work that they found themselves doing aligned with their expectations. We found around a third who didn't have a positive experience, and that carried through into their transition and into practice, and then there was an in-between group. So I would say that yes, our graduates are prepared, and they're not, because it's not consistent and it's contingent on a number of factors. There are many things. My sense is the work we've done on standards in social work education are broadly fit for purpose. There's always new innovation, and there's always a need for agility in how we apply the standards. What is not consistent is the opportunities that students have to learn in practice during education. Some students get excellent, outstanding practice experiences that reflect the kinds of teams and environments that we all want to see. Some students don't have excellent experiences because the agencies we want them to be in just can't offer placements because they don't have enough staff. So again, we have a very mixed picture, and we need to improve on that. But
can I press you on the third? Is that primarily down to that they end up, say, in a big council like Glasgow, or a small one like Clackmannanshire or the Western Isles or something, or is it down to the individual person, or is it something else?
It's typically about in practice, it's typically about their perception of the support that they have to learn through practice. Every graduate social worker will tell you that they're learning in practice, that the learning that they take from university is a significant foundation, but the learning continues critically through those first few years, because that's where they get into the depth and breadth of working with people. And the support that they experience within their teams is very inconsistent. Sometimes it's very good and sometimes it's quite poor.
Okay. Can I ask the other three then, for looking at it from the other angle, you're seeing people coming through the system. Do you think the preparation new and young social workers are getting is appropriate for what they're going to actually end up in? Ms Duncan?
So the social workers that I spoke to during the care review and have listened to since, I think what Professor McCulloch said is exactly. Some folk came in and said the job doesn't feel anything like what I expected, and others said this is the job I want to do, and then there was all shades in between. So I don't think I can add much to your assessment.
Okay. Ms Burns, did you want to come in?
I don't think I've got anything. If someone comes to me, I'll come back to you.
That's fine. I mean, on the Finance Committee, which I'm also on, we're always being told that we need to improve productivity in Scotland, in business, in the health service, and presumably in social work as well. And I'm just wondering, how can we, because we talked earlier about, if we had more finance, we could do this. Well, let's assume we're not going to have any more finance, or it's going to be 1% or something like that. So that's not going to happen. So can we use the social workers better? And I suppose I'm particularly thinking around the bureaucracy. Can we use IT? Can we use AI to help people? Because I was struck by the phrase, I think, again, Professor McCulloch, purposeful work, that people want to be actually using. And we're all frustrated as well, because we have to do stuff that we don't like doing too. So I get that. But, could we be using what the resources and the people we have better? Ms Byrne?
Yeah, so I think we can. I mean, we're saying that the financial context is absolutely critical, but we've also said, our research is telling us a number of other things that are really significant. One is that that is about the policy and legislative landscape. There are too many demands on our workforces, and we need to do a better job of saying where do the priorities lie. So, for example, social workers are saying that over the last few years, the number of entitlements and duties that are put on them, some of those correct, but actually the level of the workforce can't respond to that. So they're just in this cycle of, assessment of, and they often feel that people have got to meet a certain threshold to be able to do that. The productivity is, can we invest in earlier help and prevention? How can we do that? Some of the things that will help that is things like IT systems. We've got IC systems across children's planning that don't talk to each other. We don't have a single set of objectives.
So is that between councils or even within?
Between services. Between services. So that would support better collaboration. It would support better communication. So, if we had that, then that would help. So there's those kind of things. So I think, so setting priorities, better IT systems. I think sometimes there's work that we often see as hidden work. So how do we actually encourage better multidisciplinary working for families? Our research was saying, the kind of hub model, the kind of model that we had in Sure Start, where multi-agencies are based together and families go and families are able to get multi-agency support in one location, is the other way that we can increase productivity.
Is GDPR a problem in there, that people can't share what they might want to?
Yeah, at the moment the landscape around data sharing is complicated. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Mr. McKinlay, did you want to come in at all in this space?
Yeah, just on that last point, I think there's no doubt that data sharing is always a challenge in this stuff. My sense is sometimes it's made more of than it needs to be, and we've got a project working with the Data for Children Collaborative, part of Edinburgh University, to look exactly at how information can be shared better and owned by care experienced people, rather than having multiple agencies having lots of different information about that person. So that's a piece of work that is now underway, and we'll report within, and we'll come up with a blueprint really for how we fix that in the next 12 months or so. I think beyond that, I did find myself slightly wincing at the term productivity, and I know what we mean. And it's obviously a big debate at the moment in the NHS and other places. It has been for a long time. So I suppose that's okay as long as we're crystal clear that that's not about throughput and cases and can we make them more efficient, because that would not be helpful. If what we mean is everything we've been talking about today already, which is about freeing up opportunities for social work and all other people who are working with children and families to do that more kind of relationship-based work, because that is the productive work, that is the purposeful work. I guess my final observation...
Because we are just on that point. I mean, we've got an ageing population, we've got fewer people going to be available to work in the coming years, so each person is going to have to do more.
Or different.
Or different, exactly.
Yeah,
yes.
and I think if you end up in a place of just piling more stuff on folk, that's just not going to work. People will fall over. So that isn't the answer. And as you say, the kind of broader demographic that we know about is important there. I've just got one final very quick point, which is I do think we have had over the last however many years, understandably, I think, a tendency to, inverted commas, protect the front line. Wherever that's possible. And I get why we say that. The reality on the ground, though, is that business support roles, for example, in social work and loads of other professions have basically disappeared. Now, that work still has to be done, so we've got rid of the people who are doing that work. We haven't actually changed what the ask is, which means, and I think Professor McCulloch and Social Work Scotland research says this, it means the people who are, in inverted commas, on the front line are picking up all of that work too. So again, there's something for me about being really clear about the unintended consequences of deciding where to disinvest and where to invest that we need to be really mindful of.
Right. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you. Good morning. Celsus research identified areas for national collaboration. Can you maybe tell me a bit more about these areas and how you think they can be taken forward?
So, again, I've come back to the point. Some of the key finding was, so we need better strategies and more strategies around addressing poverty. We've got some, we've got like the Child Poverty Pathfinder, but actually we need a much more coherent approach to that and a much greater focus on how across children's planning we can work towards addressing poverty. We need to concentrate, and again, this was one of the things that came through, is that people were saying around the National Care Service it was about a structure, and they were saying actually can we not focus on structures, but can we focus on really supporting that multi-agency practice. So I've talked a bit about saying that we actually bring services together in a particular location. I've said, like we did with Sure Start, and actually we work to build the collaboration. And it means that families just come to one point rather than having to engage with a whole number of different agencies. And the other piece that's critical around collaboration is at strategic leadership level. So I sometimes hear as well people say we need leadership at all levels, but actually the research is clearly saying to us, unless we get the leadership right from the get-go at a strategic level, those are the people that understand and will set the time and the resources and the permissions to work in different ways. And again, that's sometimes a bit of hidden work, that we need more opportunities for strategic leaders in local areas to be talking more openly about what are the barriers to implementation, what is it going to mean to set priorities across children's planning, to stick to those, and actually to pull budgets and agree budgetary that are all focused on that level. So those would be some of the key things.
Okay. You were speaking earlier about decluttering the landscape.
Yep.
Can you maybe explain a bit more what you mean by that, and what would your priority be if you had a magic wand? What would be your number one thing that you would declutter the landscape with?
Yeah. So I think in terms of saying, I think we've got a range of different legislation and policy, and first of all, people don't know what sits above each other. So is GIRFEC our main driver? Is the promise our main driver? Is the promise a way of getting GIRFEC implemented? Is it the other way? So people are it can be quite confusing to say what is the key driver. If you even take, another reason that's cluttered again is if you take even something like child protection. We've got new child protection guidance, but if you're a child protection worker, you are also governed by about 20 or 30 other pieces of related legislation, like stuff around addiction, stuff around violence against women and children. So you are having to meet the demands of lots of different policies. Partly that is because as a country, and this is not unusual, and this doesn't just go for government, it goes for the sector, we're absolutely convinced that if we get something into legislation, that is going to see itself through to practice. So there's different, so we've got too many pieces of legislation, often people feel it makes a start and stop, so people start down one direction, there's a new policy and we change. I think you've asked me the question, if it was for me, I think our policy landscape around GIRFEC is still absolutely the right policy landscape. I think if we get that right, we'll get the promise right. But again, what we've got with GIRFEC, and this is the implementation challenge that we've got with a number of things, is we've got aspirations, we've got policies, we can talk about what GIRFEC will mean, but we don't actually put the time and space into saying, what is the behaviours we need to see from different workforces? How do we support them in terms of learning and development? How do we support them in terms of coaching and feedback? And how do we report on that? So there's lots of information now in the implementation kind of literature that says, if we want to actually change practice on the ground, we're going to have to put the effort into these things. So again, just a good example of work in Glasgow around relationship-based practice. They're saying we're going to commit ourselves to much more strengths-based relationship work with families. But what they realise they need to do is spend the time saying, what does that practice actually look like? How are we going to, can we get really explicit about what that means when somebody goes to the door into a family? What does that look like? How can we support that practice? How will the rest of the system need to amend to actually support that? So we need to be able to do those kind of things and take our time. So for me, it's about how can we go back to the fundamentals of GIRFEC and say, what is it going to take to implement that?
And would that be your priority then, to ensure that our children and young folk are better supported?
Yes.
Okay. If I could maybe go on to my next question, I was going to ask what further action, and I'll open it up, might be taken at a national level to help the workforce deliver the promise. And just a general question, what would you like to see in the bill to help improve things?
So one of the things that Claire's just said is this cluttered landscape. At the end of the Care Review, there were 44 pieces of legislation, 19 pieces of secondary legislation and 3 international conventions governing this thing that we call a care system. Because children and families don't live in individual silos. Since then, those numbers have gone up, not down. So I do think there is something really essential around cohesive legislation, because as Claire said, each of those pieces of legislation comes with individual duties. Some of those duties have been enacted, some of them haven't, because of level of resource or level of time, or because they conflict with one another. But not only do they drain the resources of the workforce, children and families feel that they pinball around all these individual systems and don't get anything really supportive. So I think we have to have clear legislation that enables the workforce to do the job that it wants to do, that is clear for children and families what it means, GIRFEC or the Promise or UNCRC or whatever will mean for them, and what they can expect, so that they're confident that they can get the support that they need when they need it, so that we can ensure that more children and families flourish together wherever safe to do so, and that the children and young people who need the care of the state get the very best care that the state can offer them and go on to live happy adulthood. So I think it's about tidying it all up, making sure that there's enough in place so that it's enacted properly, and that will require sequencing. I think the final thing I would say is we know from engaging with the workforce what's getting in the way. So what are the barriers? So there's a whole bunch of things where legislation is needed in order to get rid of those barriers. And we also know what's helping. And for some of those things, there may need to be legislation to ensure that it isn't a postcode lottery. So it's not just helping here or there, it is helping everywhere. So I've got quite a big wish list.
I'm finished, Convener, unless someone else would like to come in.
Nope. Okay.
Right.
Thank you. Then our final questions come from Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to carry on that theme of questioning. Welcome the panel this morning, because back in 2003, Angela Constance, the Minister at the time, told the Scottish Association of Social Workers Conference that the government aimed to establish the national agency and it would be operational by 2025. Now you have said, Fraser, that you think it's getting in the way of delivering. So if we're being completely honest, halfway through delivering the promise, the scaffolding of workforce just isn't there, is it?
I'm happy to start on that. So there's no doubt that the commitment when, as I say, when we were here a year ago, the expectation was that the National Care Service legislation would progress and that would involve the National Social Work Agency. And for reasons you all know much better than I do, that hasn't happened. So the absence of that, the lack of progress on that, I think has kind of meant that people have been waiting for this thing to come down the line and it hasn't appeared. So when I look at some of the things that were said a year ago or so, you know, they haven't progressed as much as you would like, for sure. And so I agree in part, I think, with that assessment, Mr Briggs. I think when you look at things like the kind of strategy that Professor McCulloch described very clearly last time about being integrated, so we don't have that and we need it. I think there is good work happening day in, day out in trying to support staff as best people can and to recruit locally, but we know that's not enough. It's the point about a collection of tactics. I think one maybe slightly brighter spot on the landscape is the work that Scotland has been doing around trauma and being a more trauma-informed workforce. I think there's been a lot of focus in the last few years about ensuring that the entire workforce that's in contact with children and families is more trauma-informed, trauma-aware, and I think that is a positive thing. But that, as you say, isn't the thing that's going to fix some of the fundamentals here about the size and shape of the workforce. And so, yeah, there's absolutely no doubt that this is one of the most pressing challenges we've got as we look towards 2030.
Looking at the plan to deliver the promise, it keeps referencing National Care Service. Now, 3 weeks ago, the Minister couldn't rule out ditching that care service to Parliament. I don't think we'll see a functioning bill before the end of this session. So just wondered your view on that, in terms of all these promises around workforce. Fiona, I'll maybe bring you in on that.
During the consultation on the National Care Service, I wrote a series of blogs which focused on one question and one question only, which was really asking whether the shape of the National Care Service as it was envisaged would keep the promise to children and families. And throughout the conversations and throughout the period, there was not any conclusive evidence that it would. And therefore, my position remained the same, which is with the absence of evidence of a National Care Service keeping the promise, work has to continue to keep the promise. But I think the point that you've heard from, I think, everybody here today, the prospect of a National Care Service on the horizon and the period of time that the workforce was waiting for it or working, not understanding whether it was coming or not, created delays. It also allowed, it made that progress was slower or indeed stagnated. And actually, I think Claire's articulated really well the challenge of multiple initiatives, multiple policies, etc., that stop any progress, any consistency, any stability, any clarity around we've started here, we're going to stop there, and this is what we're going to do in the meantime. For as long as there are other things coming on the horizon or other distractions, we are not laser focused on what we need to be laser focused on. And so I do think it's been a really significant barrier.
I suppose I just want to acknowledge that whilst we have been waiting for progress on the National Care Service Social Work Agency, things have not been stagnant. We have, over this period, had a review and actions from review of social work education. We've seen the introduction of a supported year for newly qualified social workers. We are seeing work going on around the post-qualifying framework. There are people this afternoon or later this morning will talk to. There are many initiatives going on, driven by the things that we've been talking about a recognition of the need of people's right to excellent services, of a committed workforce. That work is going on. It's going on alongside an uncertainty of how is this going to be enabled and rolled out. So to me, we need to kind of address that uncertainty. And it takes me back to, I think, the question you asked us, whose job is this? Mm-hmm. It's really easy to say they should have done this, they should have done that. It's incredibly frustrating because we know it needs done. And it's all of our job. It is our business to get these things progressed into a kind of framework that actually does that thing from entry to exit and is coherent. So my view is, yes, we've not seen the kind of progress around workforce development that we want to see, but there's a lot of things happening and we need all of us to continue to drive and push that forward.
So I think I'm hearing mixed opinions, though, in terms of we're either stuck in a vacuum till that's sorted in terms of the legislation, and it might be that government decide that this could be part of the Promise Bill as legislation around the establishment. I looked at the government's page today. There's just a couple of photos about what this will look like, what work will be done. So in terms of what will be needed to drive that change, and this organisation is what's meant to be doing that, it's meant to set these standards and then monitor where councils can actually take forward this work. You're saying we don't really need that agency then? That work's been happening, or it's not been happening?
I'm saying I think we need national leadership and national governance with regard to workforce development. And I'm saying while we wait for that, work is going on. So my observation is that both of these things are happening. And I'm very clear that I personally believe that we need national leadership and governance to see that consistently across the country rather than in the kind of patchy way that we see at the moment.
Claire, did you?
Yeah, well, I would just say that, you know, we're a supporter of the National Social Work Agency. We think we need one in terms of the status and profile for social work. We think we need it for all the issues that we've been talking about around workforce planning. We don't have great workforce data. I think what I would be saying is it's unfortunate it's attached to the NCS bill, because every time there's a delay in questions about that, the National Social Work Agency is affected by that. And I think the point you're hearing is we desperately need these things to be happening now. We need the workforce planning, workforce data and understanding of what we'll need in 10 years for workforce. We need it now. So actually, if there's not if there's a decision not to be made about National Social Work Agency, how else can we deliver those functions, because they're desperately needed?
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Karina.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our witnesses from our first panel today. It's been a very helpful session. Thank you for your time and your answers. I'll now suspend the meeting for 10 to 15 minutes for a break and a change of witnesses. Thank you.